One of the most common ways the fruit of the Spirit is taught is as a measure of Christian maturity. Are you more loving? Are you more patient? Do you have more joy? How is your self-control? The fruit of the Spirit becomes a kind of spiritual report card, a way of measuring how well we are doing in the Christian life. Now, growth is certainly part of the Christian life. No one would deny that. The fruit of the Spirit does reveal the Spirit's work in a believer's life. But when we look carefully at Galatians 5, Paul's immediate concern appears to be something else. Before Paul ever mentions the fruit of the Spirit, he introduces a conflict. The desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. That is the context. Paul is describing two competing influences. The flesh desires one thing, the Spirit desires another. Many sermons ask, how much patience do you have? How much joy do you have? How much self-control do you have? Those are important questions. But Paul appears to be asking a different one. What is producing this? Is this desire coming from the flesh, or is it coming from the Spirit? The fruit of the Spirit helps answer that question. That is why Paul gives two lists. First, he writes, "Now the works of the flesh are evident." Then he lists sexual immorality, jealousy, fits of anger, selfish ambition, envy, and other manifestations of the flesh. Then he writes, "But the fruit of the Spirit is..." And he lists love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The contrast is not primarily between stronger Christians and weaker Christians. The contrast is between flesh and spirit. Paul is helping believers recognize what aligns with the Spirit and what aligns with the flesh. When bitterness rises within us, Galatians identifies its source. When selfish ambition rises within us, Galatians identifies its source. When envy rises within us, Galatians identifies its source. Likewise, when love, patience, gentleness, and self-control are present, Galatians identifies their source as well. In Galatians 5, Paul introduces the fruit as part of a contrast between flesh and spirit. The fruit therefore helps believers recognize what is consistent with the Spirit's work and what is not. The fruit helps us discern the difference, and that is important because it changes how we understand walking by the Spirit. Notice Paul never says, produce fruit. The command is, walk by the Spirit. The fruit is the result. Many Christians hear that command and immediately wonder what it means. Some imagine something mystical, a feeling, an impression, a special experience. But Paul's description is remarkably practical. The flesh desires one thing and the Spirit desires another. Walking by the Spirit occurs when those desires collide and we choose the path consistent with the Spirit. The fruit helps us identify that path. When anger wants revenge, the path consistent with the Spirit is patience. When pride wants recognition, the path consistent with the Spirit is gentleness. When selfish ambition wants to put self first, the path consistent with the Spirit is love. When resentment wants to hold on to an offense, the path consistent with the Spirit is forgiveness. The fruit is not merely the destination. It helps identify the road. In fact, this creates an interesting relationship between the fruit and walking by the Spirit. The fruit is not only the outcome of following the Spirit, it also reveals the character of the Spirit's leading. If the Spirit produces love, His leading will never move us toward hatred. If the Spirit produces gentleness, His leading will never move us toward cruelty. If the Spirit produces peace, His leading will never encourage bitterness. If the Spirit produces self-control, His leading will never move us toward reckless indulgence. The fruit, therefore, does more than show us where the Spirit has been working. It helps us recognize the direction in which the Spirit is leading. Then Paul adds something that is easy to miss. If we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. Notice the order. Life comes first. The walk follows. Paul does not tell believers to walk so that they may receive life. He tells those who already live by the Spirit to keep in step with the Spirit. The Spirit gives life. The believer learns to follow. The fruit appears along the way. Many believers become discouraged because they assume the struggle itself is proof that something is wrong. But Paul describes the Christian life differently. The flesh desires one thing, the Spirit desires another. The conflict exists because two opposing influences are present. The question is not whether the struggle exists. The question is which voice we are learning to follow. The presence of conflict is not necessarily evidence that the Spirit has abandoned us. In Galatians 5, the conflict exists because the Spirit is at work opposing the desires of the flesh. This distinction matters because many Christians become discouraged. They hear a sermon on patience and immediately think about all the times they were impatient. They hear a sermon on joy and think about their struggles. They hear a sermon on self-control and think about their failures. The conclusion becomes, I must not be doing very well. But the New Testament repeatedly shows believers who possessed the Spirit and yet still struggled. Peter struggled with fear. The Corinthians struggled with jealousy, pride, and division. Barnabas was led astray by pressure from others. The presence of struggle did not prove the absence of the Spirit. The Christian life is not the absence of conflict. The Christian life is learning which voice to follow in the conflict. At this point, some Christians point out that Paul uses the word fruit rather than fruits. And that observation is worth considering. Paul does not describe 9 separate fruits. He describes one fruit with many characteristics. Now, Paul never explicitly explains why he uses the singular, so we should be careful not to claim more than the text says. But elsewhere, Paul repeatedly tells us what the Spirit is doing in the life of a believer. In Romans, he says, believers are being conformed to the image of God's Son. In 2 Corinthians, he says, believers are being transformed into the image of Christ. Earlier in Galatians, Paul says that he labors until Christ is formed in them. The Spirit's great work is not simply producing patience, or kindness, or self-control. The Spirit's great work is producing Christ-likeness. Viewed in that light, the singular word fruit becomes especially interesting. Perhaps Paul is not describing 9 unrelated virtues. Perhaps he is describing different facets of one great reality, the character of Christ being formed in his people. If someone asked us to describe Jesus, what would we say? We would say he is loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, good, faithful, gentle, self-controlled. The fruit of the Spirit reads almost like a portrait of Christ himself. And if the Spirit's purpose is to conform believers to Christ, that should not surprise us. But why would anyone consistently choose the Spirit's way? The answer is not simply because Christians should. Throughout his letters, Paul rarely motivates obedience through willpower alone. Instead, he continually reminds believers of who Christ is, what Christ has done, and what belongs to them because of Christ. He reminds them they have been forgiven, that they have been adopted, that they have been united with Christ, that they have an inheritance waiting for them, that they have been promised resurrection and eternal life. Why? Because what we value shapes what we choose. The flesh promises immediate satisfaction, immediate comfort, immediate recognition, immediate control. The Spirit points us to something greater. The reason believers can choose patience over revenge is not merely because patience is Christ-like. It is because Christ absorbed the judgment we deserved. The reason believers can forgive is because they themselves have been forgiven. The reason believers can show mercy is because they have received mercy. The reason believers can lay down their rights is because Christ laid down his rights for them. The reason believers can love sacrificially is because Christ first loved them and gave himself for them. The gospel does more than command a new way of life. It creates the foundation for it. The believer is not merely asking, what would Jesus do? The believer is increasingly shaped by, what has Jesus done for me? And that changes everything. As believers meditate on Christ, what he has done, what he has promised, and who they already are in him, their desires begin to change. Christ becomes more precious. His promises become more valuable. His ways become more attractive. The Spirit is not merely telling believers what to do. The Spirit is continually directing their attention toward Christ. This is why Paul says, and we all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image. Notice the order: beholding, then transformation. The Christian life is not merely trying harder to become loving. It is seeing Christ more clearly, valuing him more deeply, and learning to trust him more fully. As that happens, following the Spirit becomes increasingly natural, not because the struggle disappears, but because Christ becomes more desirable than the competing promises of the flesh. And that reveals something profound about the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit is not merely a list of virtues. It is a portrait of Christ. The Spirit's purpose is not simply to make us more patient, more gentle, or more self-controlled. His purpose is to conform us to the image of the Son. The fruit of the Spirit is not merely evidence that the Spirit has been at work. It is a revelation of the kind of life the Spirit produces. It shows us what walking by the Spirit looks like. And because the Spirit's purpose is to conform us to Christ, the fruit ultimately becomes a portrait of Jesus himself. The more clearly we see him, the more readily we recognize the Spirit's leading, and the more willingly we follow. That is why walking by the Spirit begins with Christ, continues through Christ, and ultimately makes us more like Christ,